I ultimately made my arrogant coworker pay $550 out of his own pocket and lose his job. It all started with a training session on my day off and his refusal to follow a policy I had just learned by heart. I worked for a large private training company that was in the process of absorbing 3 smaller sister companies. As a training consultant, my primary focus was our largest client, a role I took very seriously. I handled all their inductions and training, and because of the strong relationship I'd built, the client preferred to work exclusively with me. I was relatively new to the training industry, having only been in it for a year, but I was an old hand in the field I was teaching, hospitality. I had years of on-the-job experience at nearly every level. When I joined the training company, I quickly completed my own accredited training to become a certified teacher. This meant that all the rules about compliance, along with the details of my employee contract and handbook, were still fresh in my mind. This detail would become critically important later on. The client I managed served alcohol, so every one of their staff members needed a special certificate. My company wasn't accredited to provide this specific qualification, but one of our sister companies was. I had a group of 22 students who needed to complete or update their certification, and since my own was also about to expire, my manager, Sarah, suggested I attend the session too. It was scheduled for a Saturday, my day off, but the qualification was free. I'd get to take it with my students, and Sarah said I could take Monday off in exchange. I was more than happy with that arrangement. The training was to be held in a meeting room upstairs at one of the restaurants I worked in. I'd only been in that room a few times, as I preferred holding my sessions in the main restaurant area where it was easier to observe students in their work environment. Crucially, not a single person from my company or the sister company had asked me about the room. Now, here's a major rule in our job. As trainers, we are required to inspect any venue we use for a training session at least 1 day prior, but no more than a week before. This is to ensure the location is appropriate and meets all safety standards. If we deem a site unsafe, we have to report it and cannot hold the session there unless the issues are fixed or we get approval for a new venue. This isn't just a company suggestion, it's a legal part of our job and explicitly written into our contracts. On Saturday morning, all 23 of us arrived at 8:45 a.m. for the 9 a.m. start. I had emphasized the need to be prompt because the session was scheduled to run until 4 p.m., and many of my students had shifts to start right after, not to mention my own 2-hour drive home. The trainer, a man from the sister company I'll call Frank, came downstairs to meet us. After I introduced myself, he immediately launched into a rant about how the upstairs room wasn't safe to use. The very first thing I asked him was, "Didn't you come and do a safety check of the venue prior to today, like you're supposed to?" He said no, he didn't have time, and now he was annoyed because he had to cancel the whole session. This revealed Frank's greatest fatal flaw, a deep-seated arrogance that blinded him to the fact that time served does not equal competence. I told him calmly that this was completely unacceptable. I explained that not only had I traveled 2 hours on my day off for this, but I had 22 students from different stores whose schedules had been completely rearranged to accommodate this training. He scoffed at me, telling me off because he'd been doing this job longer than I'd been alive and that I knew nothing. While he was getting an earful from the restaurant manager, I went upstairs to conduct my own safety check of the room. I confirmed his assessment. The room was indeed unsafe. I came back down, gave my official report on the hazards to the restaurant manager, and explained what needed to be fixed before any of his staff could use that room. As I was about to call my boss, Frank came rushing back in, announcing he'd found another room at a hotel down the road. Frank made that decision with the smug confidence of a man who believed rules were for other people, completely unaware that this single, unauthorized phone call would ultimately seal his fate. He told us where to go and said he needed 15 minutes to set up. It was already 9:30 a.m., so we were running an hour behind. I pointed this out to Frank, but he brushed it off, assuring me he'd speed through the content so we'd finish on time. I called my boss, Sarah, to explain the situation. She was furious, especially because Frank hadn't bothered to contact her about any of it, let alone get authorization to book a new room. Still, she didn't want to disrupt the client's day further, so she told me to proceed and call her after the session was over. The session finally started at 10:15 a.m., and it was a complete disaster. Frank was so out of touch it was baffling to think he'd been a trainer for so long. He droned on endlessly, refused to take questions, and kept trying to relate personal stories that had no connection to the material. on 3 separate occasions. He told the entire room he was smarter than we would ever be. He wasted 30 minutes on a rambling story about his daughter's car accident from 2 years ago. By the time we broke for lunch at 12:30 p.m., we had only gotten through 4 pages of the 230-page workbook. My students were visibly frustrated and stressed about the time. I was mortified that this man was representing my company. Every stupid thing he did, you could feel his downfall coming harder and harder, and when it finally hit, it was perfect. I went back to the room early and asked him to please speed up so we could get to the test on time. He said the test would take an hour, so I pointed out that we'd need to start at no later than 3 p.m. He seemed to agree. By 2:45 p.m., we were only on page 34. I was more furious than ever. I stood up and demanded that he give us 15 minutes of reading time before the test, since we clearly didn't have time to listen to any more of his stories. He argued with me, threatening to fail me if I kept talking back. Then he said it out loud, in front of everyone, he would fail me no matter what my score was, simply because of my attitude. That was it. I walked out of the room as my students sat in stunned silence. I immediately called Sarah and explained what he had just threatened to do. She told me to put him on the phone. Immediately, I walked back in, handed Frank the phone, and went to calm my students while he took the call outside. He came back in 5 minutes later, stone-faced, and announced it was time to take the test. When it came time to hand in the tests, my students began to panic, worried that Frank would fail them out of spite. His plan was to grade each test right in front of the student who took it, which was absolutely not allowed. I stepped in. I told Frank that I wanted him to mark all the tests right now. While we all waited, I then collected everyone's papers myself and put them in a single pile for him to grade. Since he didn't know anyone's names, he could no longer be biased in his marking. I got in my car and called Sarah again, explaining everything that had happened in detail. She asked me to send her a comprehensive email with everything when I got home. I drove the 2 hours home, sat down at my computer, and wrote that email. I didn't just vent. I methodically detailed every incident, cross-referencing Frank's actions with the specific policies from our employee contracts and handbook that he had violated. This wasn't even revenge. It was just allowing someone to be their own undoing. One policy violation stuck out in my mind, the one I'd been holding on to all day. I knew the moment he booked that hotel room that he had forgotten a key rule, but I didn't remind him. He was a jerk, and I figured I might not be able to fire him myself, but I could certainly make sure he paid for his arrogance. Literally, on Monday, I was called into a meeting with my training manager Sarah, the state manager, and the GM of our company, who was conferenced in along with the state manager for our client. They praised me for how I handled the entire situation, for supporting my students, and for adhering to policy. They even gave me a cash bonus for my efforts. As for Frank, he was reprimanded for his unprofessional behavior and for failing to conduct the pre-session safety check. But the final nail in his coffin was the little detail he forgot about booking the hotel room. It was something I remembered, something he had signed in his own contract, and something I had detailed in my email. The policy, paraphrased, stated that if a consultant books a room for training purposes valued at over $300, it must be approved in writing by a manager before the booking is confirmed. Failure to get that written approval means the employee will not be reimbursed. That last-minute hotel room cost $550, because Frank never got approval, not even verbally, let alone in writing. That was $550 he had to pay out of his own pocket. On top of that, our client formally requested that Frank never be involved with their business again. Given his long list of ethical and professional failures, threatening to fail me, attempting to grade tests in a biased manner, skipping the safety check, and the unauthorized booking, he was fired from the company. So after one terrible day, Frank was out of a job and short $550. It just goes to show that being in a job for a long time doesn't mean you're good at it. Sometimes, it just means you've had more time to forget the rules. What do you think is the best way to handle a coworker who thinks their seniority makes them immune to the rules?